So, good morning, listeners. I'm Caroline Derby, 19th Countess of Derby, and I couldn't be more thrilled by the response to episode 1 of the new series on Duchess the podcast. So, I've had a lot of requests to actually see the treasures that I've uncovered over the last 30 years. And so, to help me explain some of these treasures is Dr Stephen Lloyd, our curator, who's worked with us for, I think, 11 years now. My longest serving curator, and as a result we have a tremendous partnership because he's the brains and I am the energy, and I come up with a theory and then he authenticates it. So let's go to the Bosworth Horn, which I've had a lot of comments from yesterday. Stephen, describe how you found this in the silver vaults here at Knowsley.
Well, it was just at the beginning of COVID and we were looking through the vaults here, and at the back of the vaults, we found this on the lower shelf. We found this remarkable object, which had really been overlooked for decades because we thought it was a Victorian fake. But after we had some very interesting technical research done, radiocarbon dating, we found that this cow horn was dated between 1484 and 1636. So it cannot be a Victorian fake. But the question is really, is this carving original to the early 16th century, late 15th century, or is it later?
Later.
Now, it was turned in the early 19th century into a musical horn with this mouthpiece to turn it into a trumpet, and it has these silver mounts at the end of the horn and at the base of the horn, and they are hallmarked London 1808. So we know that's when it was turned into a musical horn, but all the decoration appears to be late 15th century, early 16th century. So, either round the time of the Battle of Bosworth or soon after. Now, the main elements of the decoration are here. The Stanley coat of arms, the Earls of Derby, with the Isle of Man here, the three legs, the Triskelion. And then this damaged area here is the Barony of Strange. And the first Earl, Thomas Stanley, the first Earl of Derby's son, George, married Joan Lestrange of the Barony of Strange at Knockin in Oswestry in Shropshire, which was a very important barony because her aunt was Elizabeth Woodville, who was married to King
When
Edward
you say
IV.
that's damaged, Stephen, is that damaged or worn? Is that because people actually held it?
Well, it's a bit strange because the Stanley arms are in immaculate condition, but for some reason the Strange arms are damaged, and perhaps that's because she was so closely connected to Elizabeth Woodville, who was wife of Edward IV, and Lady Margaret Beaufort was really the mother of the wife of the first Earl, the mother of King Henry VII, was really the victor of the Wars of the Roses.
And how long do you think this would have taken to carve?
Well, we don't know that yet, but it's obviously a really skillful job because the horn is so thin. It's a very light object, so there are still quite a few mysteries to unpack about this. But we're very excited. We know that it is an old object.
Yes. Well, my conspiracy theory, of course, needs to be reined in because I have this image that this horn was carved at the Battle of Bosworth while they were waiting on the hill, and somebody actually carved this iconography on the horn for Thomas Stanley's grandson, who'd been born the year before, as a christening present to take back home. But that's just because that's family myth. But let's talk about this portrait up here, because she is the key figure in the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. This is Lady Margaret Beaufort, who is married to Thomas Stanley, who swapped sides, and Stephen can tell us a bit about her.
Well, she is the richest and most powerful woman, arguably, of the 15th century. She is a great heiress in her own right. She's the Beaufort heiress. She's very early on in her life, only age 12, she's married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and at the age of 13 she gives birth to her only child, who is Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Extraordinary story he has is in exile. The last of the Lancastrians is in exile in Brittany. He comes back in 1485 to challenge for the throne against King Richard III, the Yorkist, and of course, as we all know, he wins the Battle of Bosworth. And the key at that battle was the switching of the Stanley army, the biggest private army in England.
How many was our family army then?
There were 8,000 troops from the northwest,
yes.
but they stood aside at the battle. So they only made their decision, Thomas Stanley only made the decision to switch sides at the battle. Though probably beforehand they'd met with Henry secretly.
Yes.
And Lady Margaret is as the mother of Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, is the power behind the throne.
But wouldn't it be wonderful if this was the horn that they called the troops to battle, to go from one side to the other?
Well, at this point, it's a drinking horn, so okay. And I think it's more of a celebratory, commemorative object.
This is where Stephen reins me back in.
And I think it's still, we've still got a lot more work to do on it, but there is a lot of Tudor iconography in
yes.
in the imagery here.
And family myth is very important in all these things, and this was always called by the family the Bosworth horn. It's just up to us to
try and prove it.
To prove it now, which is taking us 30 years. And then, Stephen, describe what this is.
Well, this is an extraordinary object. I mean, this is a very modern, it's a very ancient material. It's millions of years old. It's very heavy. As the horn is very light, this is very heavy. And these are 3 stones. And these are the stones, they're the fragments from the modern tomb for King Richard III's remains, which were reinterred at Leicester Cathedral 7 years ago. There was a remarkable piece of archaeology, emergency archaeology, done in the famous car park at Leicester, a council car park, at the site of the Greyfriars Chapel, where Leicester, near the Battle of Bosworth, where very unceremoniously Richard III's body corpse was laid in the nave of the Greyfriars. We know this, and then the Greyfriars was demolished in the Reformation. So then gradually the memory of not the fact that Richard III was buried in Leicester, but where the Greyfriars was located and Richard III's burial site.
I feel very strongly about this tomb and this particular artefact because it was given to us when we attended the ceremony for the interment. And what I felt very strongly when I was there, that there was this man, rightly or wrongly, he was a king, but he's buried a long, long way away from his wife and his son, both of whom predeceased him. So, and there's no mention of them. And I know his wife, Queen Anne Neville, which is my maiden name, they were cousins, but they were also very fond of each other. It was a love match. And they had this child who they adored, who sadly died, and Queen Anne Neville is buried at Westminster Abbey, but the child, the Prince of Wales, is buried at Middleham Parish Church, and the father is now buried at Leicester Cathedral. And I know that's the correct thing to do, but one day I'd like to put a plaque saying, "In loving memory, with loving wife, loving son."